Good morning and welcome to Skipton Baptist Church Online. We're really pleased that you can join us as we begin our new series looking at the book of Romans in the New Testament. And as we do that, I want to ask you, do you recall doing memory verses? Maybe at Sunday school or at holiday clubs. And it's a great thing to do, memorizing scripture, some really great truths. I'm sure if asked, you probably can remember some of them even now. I'm also pretty sure that you learned a good number of them which were found in the book of Romans, because there are some amazing verses packed with power, depth, insight, hope and blessing within this book. Yet often this is what Romans remains for many people, the place where some of the best verses are found, and then it's avoided for the rest of it. Perhaps there is a wariness of digging into Romans, perhaps a sense of intimidation, a fear even of the deep theology which it's packed with, or maybe not really getting some of the analogies that are used or the Jewish background to some of the thinking. Or perhaps it's some of the teachings on sin and sinfulness, which at least may make you feel uncomfortable these modern days, or if not, wish you could ignore or explain them away. When you mention that you're looking at the book of Romans, it may bring out a number of different responses. John Stott, the great Bible teacher, once said he had a love-hate relationship with the book. Romans actually is a brilliant letter. It's the closest thing we have to Paul writing an exhaustive systematic theology and basis of the Christian faith. But it's so much more than that as well, because this book is dynamite. Literally, Greek dunamis means powerful, because the book, the entirety of Romans, is all about gospel from start to finish. And it's had really significant impacts on people over many years. In the 4th century, the teacher St. Augustine, he discovered the letter of Romans from a voice prompting him to read it, where he learned he should put off his sinful past and put on Christ. In the 16th century, Martin Luther, an Augustine monk struggling with his own weight of sin and not being able to please God in his eyes, found in the book of Romans the reminder of God's grace. He says, "I felt myself to be reborn going through the doors of paradise. I broke through." In the 18th century, John Wesley was an unwilling participant at a meeting in Aldersgate Street in London, and hearing from Romans and Luther's experience, he writes that 9:15 he felt his heart strangely warmed, and that he did trust Christ for salvation, and he'd taken his sins away. In the 20th century, the theologian Karl Barth, in his commentary about Romans, he notes that readers will probably be able to tell that in his writing, a joyful sense of discovery, which has had repercussions even now. And the actor David Suchet, famous for being Poirot and the voice of the NIV Bible, came to faith after reading Romans in a Bible in a hotel room. Over the next couple of months, we will be journeying through the letter to Romans. Appropriately, we'll have a break for Easter, and then we'll push on through to Pentecost. But on any journey like this, it's good to have a map to see where we're going and to keep us on track. And so we're basing this series on the work of Andrew Ollerton and his book Romans, A Letter That Makes Sense. And he uses an analogy, which we're going to slightly follow, of going on a hike up a mountain with 10 stopping points along the way. And the 10 stopping points are the root of the gospel, the valley of sin, the crux of salvation, the place of peace, the ridge of freedom, the summit of hope, the cloud of mystery, the descent of devotion, the return to community, and the onward mission. And this morning we're looking at the root of the gospel, a general introduction to the book. You see, as we said, the thing about Romans is that it is all about gospel. From the very start, as we'll see today as we unpack this, the gospel over those 16 chapters, initially to the context of the Christian community in Rome in the middle of the 1st century, and even more so now in Skipton in the 21st century. We're going to be looking into Romans, what the message was for those who originally heard it, but also looking through Romans and seeing our world through it and the situation through which it was written in. So who actually wrote the letter of Romans? Well, that's an easy one, isn't it? It was Paul. It says so in verse 1. Actually, yes and no. And it's true that he did write it, but actually we read in chapter 16 that it was actually a guy called Tertius who wrote the letter down. Tertius is what is known as an amanuensis, or a secretary or scribe, who was writing down what Paul says. It's commonly accepted Paul had some kind of physical difficulty, most likely an increasingly losing his sight, and possibly conditions as a result of the many physical beatings and trials that he had. So fair play to Tertius being able to keep up with Paul's flow of consciousness. It was probably written around 55 to 57 AD, while Paul is living in Corinth during his third missionary journey before he indeed heads to Rome. And he is writing it to the church in Rome. Now, if you've never been to Rome, one thing that's obvious when you go there, the sheer number of churches, over 365, one for each day of the year. But that was not the situation then. In the mid-1st century, just a couple of decades after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, which is incidentally quite a short comparative time, there was a church in Rome, but it was only about 200 people out of a population of around at least 500,000. There was no church building. It was comprised of a number of small house church gatherings of those who followed Jesus. Perhaps maybe 5 or 6 of them. And Paul wasn't the founder of the Christian community in Rome. Some suggest it was Peter who founded the Christian community in Rome after he left Jerusalem in Acts 12. Others suggest that it was a small group of Jews who'd been present at Pentecost in Acts 2 who'd returned to Rome. But it's pretty certain that they were originally Jewish believers, and the gospel grew within the Jewish community in Rome, but it started to spill out to Gentiles too. But unfortunately, there was a clash within the Jewish community between those who were Christian and those who weren't, and this led to so much of a hassle that the Emperor Claudius ends up kicking all the Jews out of Rome, because as a writer called Suetonius writes, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he, the emperor, expelled them all from Rome. And it's likely these clashes were between Jews and Jewish followers of Jesus. And because of this expulsion, it's where Paul actually meets Priscilla and Aquila, who he mentions in Romans 16, in Corinth, and he works alongside them for a while. But gradually, with Claudius's death, Jews started returning to Rome. But when they returned, the church had continued in their absence and had grown, and now Gentile believers were in the majority. And so we have this really important context where there's a clash between Jewish and Gentile Christians. And Jews were returning to Rome, insisting on Christians following the laws of Moses and treating Gentile Christians as almost like second-class citizens. And we have Gentile Christians who are now the majority in the church, not following the strict laws of Moses. And all of this is happening within this small community in the city of Rome. Now, to get a flavour of what the Roman makeup of the church was like, we just need to look at the end of Romans, and it's Romans chapter 16, where we have a list of 27 names of people that Paul sends his greetings to, and the names give an awful lot away. It's not just an arbitrary set of names. Within this, we have names that are Greek, that are Latin, that are Jewish. We have men and women, including women in pretty prominent positions in the church. We've got wealthy, potentially aristocratic families, tradespeople, and also some names that are usually associated with those who are slaves. Different backgrounds, different resources, different heritages. This mix of people unsurprisingly led to divisions, disagreements, and ultimately a sense of disunity, perhaps with one house church vying against the other. But I wanted to point out that these are real people that we're dealing with here. In Romans 16:23, Paul mentions Erastus, the director of public works in Corinth, sending his greetings. And in the mid-20th century, there was a pavement slab that was discovered in Corinth, dug up by archaeologists, which say Erastus, in return for his idealship, his public works directorship, paved this at his own expense. These are real people, real Christians, trying to work out how to follow Jesus in a society which is completely alien, where human trafficking and slavery are rife, shallow, capricious gods are worshipped, ruled by an authoritarian despot who demands to be worshipped as Lord and Son of God, a culture of extreme wealth and desperate poverty, of indulgence in sex and sensuality and violent blood sports, all the while being in a real minority which has got significant divisions and disunity going on. And the pursuit of unity in the midst of this diversity is one of Paul's aims in the letter of Romans, especially with the situation with Jews and Gentiles. Fundamentally finding out that the only truly unifying thing for these desperate peoples and groups is the heart of the gospel of Jesus, that we are all sinners saved by grace. So to this situation and context around 57-58 AD, Paul sends Phoebe, a woman from Kenkrai near Corinth, to carry his letter, perhaps under the guise of being on a business trip to Rome. And when she gets there, her role is to read the letter to all the different house churches in Rome and explain its contents. Now it's time to use your imagination. A family of Jewish believers have gathered in a large villa on one of the hills around Rome, having eaten food brought to them by the household slaves, in honour of a special guest who, after dinner, when the doors are bolted shut, the curtains are drawn, and are all sat in the main room, she brings out a parchment hidden within her bag, and with hushed silence, Phoebe begins to read, Paul, a servant of Christ. When we studied the book of Acts a little while ago, we jokingly noted that Paul must have had a great travel agent. Just look at the places he visited during his missionary journeys. That would cost a small fortune today. And he wanted to go to Rome. It was on his wish list of places to go. And now I love Rome. It's one of my favorite cities. I've visited it a number of times, including for the first time on our honeymoon. And it's probably no surprise to those who know me. I'm a bit of a history geek about the Romans, but also a church history geek as well. But I also like pizza, pasta, coffee, gelato, the architecture, the history. It's a real tourist spot. And great as the architecture is now, and definitely was in the first century, with all the technological advances and luxury that there may have been at the time, these weren't the primary reasons why Paul wanted to get to Rome. We discover in his writings that he had a couple of reasons. First of all, he wanted to get to Rome to encourage the church and to be encouraged by them, this church, which is at the very heart of the empire. And he wanted to be there at the heart of empire to preach the gospel in Rome, a pretty audacious thing to do, talking about the Son of God, Jesus, to a place that worshipped literally the emperor as Son of the God. But he didn't want to stop there. Paul wanted to push on from Rome to Spain to preach the gospel where no one else had been before. We don't know if he actually got to do that. It's the Gospels and Acts is silent about it. But Paul was desperate to get the gospel out there. And he reveals in chapter 1 here that he actually feels that he owes it to people. Paul calls himself a slave of Jesus Christ. Now that's quite a loaded word, particularly from a free man in a culture and a context where slavery was rife. But it reflects his complete commitment and conviction of following Jesus. He's desperate for others to know about Jesus. Obsessive would be today's description. But why? We read in verse 14 of chapter 1 that he feels he owes it to people. I am bound actually means I owe it to them. Now, not in the sense that they've given him £10 and now he owes them £10, but more like he's been given £10 from someone to give freely to another person. That £10 is not his, he owes it to the person for whom it was intended. Only it's not £10, it's the gospel, the message of Jesus. He and we have been given the gospel, the good news, to give to others as someone gave to us. And my question is, do we ever see it that way? That we owe it to people who don't know the gospel to let them know about it? Or are we holding on to something which has been entrusted to us, which is meant to be passed on to others? But I want us to focus particularly, just for a few moments, on verses 16 and 17, what one writer has called Paul's gospel in a nutshell. Now, I don't know about you, that's a good, easy phrase, but sometimes nutshells are hard and difficult to get into. And perhaps that's not far off for these words before us as well. Maybe we're very familiar with these words, but they are packed full of meaning and depth and may seem hard to crack. But they're important because this is the complete picture that Paul then goes on to unpack throughout the rest of the letter, in the same way as, I don't know, if you have an IKEA item of furniture, you have on the front cover the picture of what it looks like, and then inside all the different stages of putting it together, it's all broken up. That's similar to what Paul's saying here. He's outlining what the gospel is and then unpacking it for the rest of the letter. And he starts by saying, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Now, that's a pretty outstanding claim by Paul, especially thinking he's at the very heart of Rome itself, in a society which seemingly at the time had everything: stylish buildings, thriving entertainments, even heated swimming pools, and a paranoid, all-powerful ruler. To this place, what would the story of a little-known, executed peasant foreigner have to offer? The fact that Paul says he's not ashamed kind of hints at least an awareness of the potential of this gospel to be something to be ashamed of, to cause embarrassment. And maybe we can identify a little bit with that. We may not be ashamed of going to church. We might not be ashamed of having a spirituality, of faith, or even talking about God even. But what about the gospel? What about Jesus? For Paul was convinced that even within these very fulfilled lifestyles available in this cosmopolitan Rome, people still needed Jesus. So I ask, how confident are you that in Skipton, your friends, your colleagues, your family need Jesus, need the gospel? If I'm honest, at times I reflect on the different levels of people's comfort in many people's lives in our community. People who seemingly have everything they need or could want, and I inwardly ask, why would they want or even need to hear anything about the gospel of Jesus? They seem pretty satisfied with life as it is, certainly unless some crisis comes along. Perhaps this betrays a lack of confidence in the gospel, or a sense of embarrassment even, or a lack of confidence that people might even need the gospel. How do you feel when conversations turn to faith amongst your friends, amongst your friends or your colleagues or people at a local club that you go to? How confident do you feel in the effectiveness of the gospel today? Are you plagued by doubt? Are you very uncertain? Are you up and down? Are you mostly confident, or are you fully assured? Another understanding of this word for ashamed is offended, and the gospel can be seen as embarrassing or offensive because it essentially tells us that we are lacking something, and we don't like that, do we? We don't like to be told that. What it tells us is our bad is really bad, so bad that we can't help ourselves and we need God's Son to sort it out for us. But it also tells us our good is not good enough. We can't rely on our own moral achievements, our own goodness to justify ourselves or compare ourselves even favorably to others. Let's be honest, we don't like hearing that about ourselves. So why should others, eh? In that sense, why is Paul so convinced? Why is he not ashamed? It's because he has seen it at work. He's experienced it himself. It says, because it, the gospel, is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. The power of God for salvation, first for Jews, then for Gentiles. It's very easy for us to slip into the sense that the gospel is something which is just told, rehearsed, and in yes, some ways we can just explain what the gospel is. But the gospel is much more than a collection of words, ideas, even beliefs. It's more than a theology, a philosophy, more than a creed. What is gospel? What would you say if you wanted to say what the gospel was? Well, really fundamentally, gospel, good news, comes from the Greek word euangelion. Good, angelos, herald. The word was used as announcements that gives something decisive had happened, something like the birth of a new ruler. But very often, evangelion was used when there was a decisive victory in a distant land, and heralds would be sent. Heralds, or angelos, would be sent from the victory to tell everyone around that they came in contact with that this battle had been won. And similarly, that is just what the gospel is. It's just an announcement that a king was born and that a victory was won. That was won on a battlefield outside of Jerusalem, on a rocky outcrop hill and a garden graveyard, defeating not an army of soldiers, but the very heart of sin, and as resultant effect, death. The cross and resurrection are pivotal. Otherwise, the Gospels, the New Testament, the early church onwards would have merely just focused on the sage teachings of a wise prophet called Jesus, but they didn't. The power of the gospel is the power of God seen in the cross and resurrection. That is the message at the heart of gospel. Death and sin have been defeated. New life and eternal hope are available to us. This is gospel, and it is effective. We have seen it, haven't we? Perhaps in our own lives or in the lives of others. It's personal. It's for us as individuals. It's relational. It impacts Jews and Gentiles, men and women, rich and poor. It affects relations, but it also is on a global and even cosmic scale, governments to galaxies. If the gospel, one writer says, if the gospel was only about getting us to heaven, it's a pretty small gospel. It resonates throughout this broken universe. The gospel is effective. And I wonder if in trying to make the good news about Jesus acceptable, palatable even, that we sometimes dilute its message down to just another lifestyle enhancement option for people. Paul's confidence in the gospel, his not ashamedness, is because the gospel is not just powerful, it is power. It is the power for salvation. Another aspect of that sense is that the power of God, it's the power of God, it's the work, it's the action of God. Regardless of how technologically, sociologically advanced and evolved our Western society considers itself, that's surely how Rome would have seen itself too. Our basic human condition remains as it always has been. The myth of human progress is just that. It's a myth. We can do so much, but we still can't change our human heart. And in the light and reality of evil, suffering, and death, everyone needs to hear about the forgiveness and hope which only the announcement of the victory of Jesus can bring. The gospel is power, the power of God for salvation. And we take this seriously. Let's put it into action, unashamed about holding on to the gospel of Jesus being our hope, our salvation. We will see the power of God seen in his gospel, that it's still effective today. It's effective to heal and restore broken hearts and relationships. It's effective to give hope in the bleakest of situations. It's effective to grant forgiveness for sins and freedom from addictive and destructive patterns of behavior. It's effective to transform lives damaged from the choices made by ourselves or imposed by others. It's effective to impact the way we live, our priorities, our lifestyles, our agendas. It's effective to give us real life, which is to be lived now and will to be lived continuing beyond the barrier of death itself. Thanks be to God. The gospel is the power of God for salvation. And this is why testimony is important. How we've come to know this Son of God, Jesus, and what difference, what impact has this gospel had on us. But Paul writes that this gospel is for all who believe, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. To the believers in Rome now, majority Gentile church, it was a reminder that the gospel, the good news, the announcement came to Jews first. Firstly through their chosenness in the Old Testament, but mainly through Jesus coming as a Jew and the first believers coming from his Jewish background believers. But it didn't stop there. For the Jews in the Roman church, they needed to hear that this message was an offer for the whole world. It was what God's intention was for Israel in the first place. It is for everyone. It's an unlimited invitation, but it's got limited access in the sense that it is for those who believe. Not a series or a set of texts or tenets, That's part of it, but it's about those who trust, lean on, rely on the gospel truth of Jesus' victory over sin and death. Paul goes on to say, for or because in this gospel, in this announcement, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. The gospel is God's power because within it we see his righteousness. Now, righteousness is one of those words, the big kind of theological word, and maybe seems a bit intimidating. It's only ever really used in a Jewish judicial context, and that means that it captures a sense of justice being done. And righteousness essentially means things being made right, in a state of rightness. It's a positional word in the sense that relations are sorted. Nothing is owed, the debts are paid, relations are restored. There's nothing blocking the way. We are in good standing. There is nothing in the way blocking the relationship. There's two ways of understanding this rightness, this righteousness. It's of God and from God. The righteousness or the rightness of God is seen or revealed in Jesus. It's God's rightness, his holiness, his perfection, his justice, which is revealed in Jesus. Jesus' perfect, obedient, sinless life, and Jesus' death, satisfying justice for all sin, for all time, for all people. And that's why the cross and resurrection is pivotal. It's why we preach the cross. It's what Paul says in other places, in other letters. Remove the cross from the gospel and it loses its power. It's why we must proclaim the cross, the need for it, an awareness of our sin, and the triumph of it, the defeat of sin and death. Jesus at the cross, where one hymn writes, where wrath and mercy meet, and where God's righteousness, his rightness, is revealed in all its power and effective splendor. Jesus' resurrection was proof he was who he said he was, but it was also proof that he achieved at the cross what needed to be done and conquered sin and the curse of death. Therefore, he couldn't be held by death. The punishment for sin and sinfulness taken by Jesus for each and every one of us. And it's accessed by placing our trust in the truth of this through faith, because our rightness, our righteousness isn't up to much. And we know that, don't we? Even the good things that we do are often so easily tainted and tarred. This is the gospel. This is the good news, a righteousness of God revealed through Jesus. But the second way is this rightness is from God to us. None of us have a rightness of our own. As we said, this is one of the reasons why the gospel can seem so offensive, both to irreligious and religious people alike. We don't want to think that our rightness isn't good enough, but we are made right by Jesus, and any rightness or righteousness we have is only by Jesus. It's a little bit of an illustration that we can see is that we are distorted and damaged by sin and the effects of sin, but through the lens of Jesus, God sees us and our righteousness, which is actually Jesus' righteousness, and he sees us as perfected. This righteousness is by faith, first to last, nothing to do with us, accessed by faith alone. But as Luther, who discovered the freedom from law in reading Romans, realizing that we can only access God and true life through full reliance on Jesus and what he has done. He wrote, we are saved by faith alone, but the faith that saves is never alone. If it is real, it should have an impact on our ongoing life. Paul refers to this earlier in the chapter, in chapter 1, verse 5, where he says, through Jesus, we've received grace and apostleship to call Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith for his name's sake. The gospel reveals the way of righteousness, believing obedience, one writer puts it, choosing to follow the way of rightness seen in the way of Jesus. John Stott notes that God's faithfulness is always first. Faith is a gift from him, and our faith is never other than a response to him, a response to God. Our faith isn't good enough. This is gift from God too. It's always a response to God's faithfulness to the promises he made in the Old Testament to sort out the mess that we made. And he goes on to quote from Habakkuk, the righteous will live by faith. Those made righteous by faith will live. So Romans is a densely packed letter, and there's so much really deep stuff which essentially unpacks and applies the heart of Paul's message throughout the entire letter. The gospel is God's power for salvation, revealing through Jesus the reality of this power, which is available to us all, and reveals the way of righteousness, of rightness with God, a believing obedience. I pray that God may help each of us to discover, rediscover the real power of the gospel message, that we may also be eager and not ashamed of this good herald, this good announcement, proclaiming the truth of the gospel, that Jesus has won the victory over sin and death, that life can be ours and yours by faith alone, life not only now but for eternity, because of what he has done and not from ourselves. Amen.